Hello and welcome back. Pardon me. Today we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, as well as some of the other religious currents that were happening in the Catholic world during the same time. So this is Martin Luther here. You may have heard Martin Luther, uh, generally considered to be the author of the Protestant Reformation, although there were other important names as well. So, as a little background, in the 1400s is sort of the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. And what that is sort of a resurgence of interest in classical Greek and Roman culture, spurred in part by a new wealthy sort of middle class merchants in Venice and various parts of Italy, um, were making money and investing in art and literature and things like that. At the same time, in the East, the Byzantine Empire finally fell. So it's finally the end of Rome, right? That Rome had lasted a couple thousand years. It finally falls to the Ottoman Turks and the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire. In the 1400s, you've got Christopher Columbus and other explorers, quote, discovering, the Americas and exploiting the resources there. And those trade routes quickly become central and essential to the European economy and to those growing empires there. Um, the slave trade uh, among those important economic factors. The a Spanish empire was growing and finally pushed the Muslims out of Spain. So Islam had, during its heyday, had expanded widely and had taken over parts of Spain. So the Spanish kicked the Muslims out of Spain. The Muslims were peacefully coexisting with the Jews, but the Spanish were kicking out the Jews as well, along with the Muslims. And back in the Islamic world, their sort of philosophical peak had sort of come and gone, and mainstream Islam was becoming a bit more conservative and less interested in Western philosophy. The Western Church was also, coming out of the Black Plague, right? So the Black Plague had killed a third of Europe, huge numbers of people. Um, it's hard to, hold on to a strong faith in God when people are just dying left and right. Um, you had the church and the state deeply intertwined. You had the Holy Roman Emperor. Um, this is the church was very powerful and very rich, and this is just sort of a formula for corruption and hypocrisy, right? You give any institution enough money and power, and there's going to be people that use it to bad ends. So this was the case with the church at the time as well. Um, and the philosophical Christianity of the 1200s of uh, St. Thomas Aquinas and so on was beginning to become less popular, and more mystical approaches uh, that downplayed human rationality. There's a whole chapter in the Armstrong book about mysticism that we didn't have time for, um, but it's an important strain in all these various religions that were basically a reaction against philosophical logical approaches to religion, and saying no, it's this is not a rational thing, right? It is a um, again, spiritual experience, sort of emotional revelation type of thing, right? So, here's a quote from the time: "Of what use is it to discourse learnedly on the Trinity if you lack humility and therefore displease the Trinity?" Right? So, as they're saying, by acting so smart, you're not being humble, and so you're pissing off God, right? I would far rather feel contrition than be able to define it. If you knew the whole Bible by heart and all the teachings of the philosophers, how would this help you without the grace and love of God? So it's almost like trying to understand or rationalize the Bible is a little too arrogant, and in doing it, you are actually sort of performatively disobeying the Word of God. Right? So, in popular Christianity, was drifting in. There's always this popular drift into a kind of polytheistic vibe. Uh, so, and the everyday person, again, they're not going to be super interested in trying to follow the proofs of the existence of God, or in a God that looks like Aristotle's unmoved mover, right? Most people can relate to Jesus on the cross, and they can relate to uh, other humans, right? So there was a lot of focus on Christ and his suffering, meditating on the suffering of Christ and on his personality, and also focus on saints, right? Martyrs that also suffered, or just exemplary humans, right, that were sainted by the Catholic Church. Uh, so this is, a, seems to be a basic human impulse to need something tangible, concrete, anthropomorphic to invest your religious feeling in. And this also comes with a focus on sort of the opposite, the dark side. So, demons and witches and things like that, which are also more tangible. Right? So this led to the Inquisition. So, there developed a sort of paranoid mania about witches and demons and people practicing evil and worshiping the devil. And this sort of spread across Europe like wildfire. And so the Inquisition continued for decades and decades. Um, so suspected witches, which were, typically women, right? Heretics, which were often Jews, were, you know, accused, right? I mean, there was sort of a mock trial kind of, uh, vibe to it, but in a, essentially it was, if you were accused, there was no way out, right? You would be tortured until you confessed, right? If you denied it, that was just evidence that you were a witch. Um, so it was, yeah, a general persecution of, people that were relatively powerless in society. So this is the era that Martin Luther grows up in, and he certainly was, of his time. He believed in witches and devils. He really felt that he was constantly battling Satan for his soul on a daily basis. He once threw a dog out of a tower window because he believed it was the devil trying to mess with him. So, poor dog, right? Um, so he was, probably the biggest name, but not the only religious thinker that is involved in what we call the Protestant Reformation. It was a reaction against what were seen as some of the excesses and corruptions of the Catholic Church, and eventually broke off from the Catholic Church and formed a whole new brand of Christianity. Um, but it was not as organized as you might think or as it seems now. And it wasn't always necessarily directly aimed at corruption in the Catholic Church. We often think that it was sort of like Luther started the whole thing because of, as we'll talk about, he was mad about indulgences. I'll explain what those are later. And it was a principled reaction and organized split. It was more, haphazard and had various people with various bones to pick going on all at the same time. But it certainly did all erupt and happen around the same time. So here's a quote from Luther. Although I lived a blameless life as a monk, I felt that I was a sinner with an uneasy conscience before God. I also could not believe that I had pleased him with my works. Far from loving that righteous God who punished sinners, I actually loathed him. I was a good monk and kept my orders so strictly that if ever a monk could get to heaven by monastic discipline, I was that monk. All my companions in the monastery would confirm this, and yet my conscience would not give me certainty. I always doubted and said, you didn't do that right. You weren't contrite enough. You left that out of your confession, right? So Luther is so critical of himself and has such a high standard for what he thinks must be required for, salvation or righteousness, that he begins to almost hate God, right, for putting him in this position, giving him this sort of like almost unattainable goal. So a while back we talked about St. Augustine and his confessions, right? So St. Augustine again was an ancient author, and he. But what I said about his confessions was this is not a typical biography where he just describes his exploits as a general or something. Instead, it's this detailed account of his inner life and his inner turmoil and his conscience and his desires. And this really culminates and then erupts and splits Christianity in Martin Luther. Martin Luther also, right, is taking this idea to the logical extreme, so self-critical, right, of every impulse. He he says, look, my behavior is perfect, right? It's not my behavior that's the problem. It's my mind and my soul. I can't convince myself that I'm worthy of God's grace. So his big breakthrough is when he sort of realizes that I'm never going to be worthy, right? Um, the point is that humanity is innately fallen, right? We can't do anything to save ourselves, right? Good works, piety, prayer, um, none of it's going to help. It'll never get us right across the finish line. Only God can do that for us, right? God has to decide. It's entirely up to God whether I'm saved or not. There's nothing I can do that would ever measure up. So if that's the case, right? If there's literally nothing I can do that will help me get to heaven, it's entirely up to God whether God decides I do or don't. Um, it would also seem to mean that all my philosophizing is not going to help either. All my intellectual achievements are just so much worthless effort, right? So um, Luther did believe, he didn't sort of totally give up on Christianity. He believed the Nicene Creed, the basics of, the Christian doctrine. Uh, but he rejected any attempts to try to prove those beliefs using logic or prove the existence of God. And instead, he advocated faith. He says your relationship with God should be one of faith, which is a total blind leap into the darkness, right? He says you'll never be able to reason yourself into belief in God. Um, you just have to go for it and trust, right? Um, Kierkegaard really latches onto this later in the 1800s. He's a famous philosopher, and he has a long book where he uses as his core example of faith Abraham, right, agreeing to sacrifice his son Isaac, right, when God commands him to, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, right? Because if you recall, God had promised him, oh yeah, you're going to have a son, Isaac, and he's going to be the father of a great people, and I'm going to have a covenant with those people, right? And then he turns around and says to Abraham, now kill him. And it's like, what, right? But Abraham just says, okay, God, right? That's the sort of faith that Kierkegaard thinks uh, is what Luther is talking about. So famously, Luther wrote a list of 95 complaints that he had with the Catholic Church, and he nailed them to the door of the church, the All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And it's a long list, but one of the most famous complaints was against the sale of indulgences. So the idea here was, so in the Catholic Church, there's this concept of purgatory, right? Purgatory doesn't, well, it's controversial whether it shows up in the Bible, but it became sort of worked into Christian Catholic doctrine that it was this sort of place in between heaven and hell where, um, if you died and you weren't bad enough to go to hell, but you weren't quite good enough yet to go straight to heaven, you would stay in purgatory for a while, a year, 1,000 years, right? There was time, is like expands in these realms of the eternal um, until your soul was sort of cleansed enough and ready enough to go to heaven. And so the church would allow people to make donations, and in return, they said that their friends or relatives' time in purgatory would be shortened. Right? You could cut years off your sentence in purgatory. So Luther saw this as just clear graft and corruption. Right? You're trying to buy your salvation. So he wasn't. Uh, he thought that was um, pretty terrible. Um, Another target of the Lutheran or other sort of Protestant reformers was the elaborate system of saints, right, and all the beautiful art really in stained glass windows picturing saints and the statues, and a lot of the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic Church. Uh, to them, that smacked of paganism and idol worship, right? Why are you worshiping saints? You should only be worshiping God, contemplating Jesus. All this other stuff is the kind of thing that pagans do, right? So there was a lot of, in countries where Protestantism won, there was a lot of destruction of a lot of works of art from the Catholic churches, and many Protestant churches forbade, pictures or statues or anything of that. There's very plain sort of, if I don't know if any of you are Protestants or been to Lutheran churches, they're pretty plain, simple sort of houses of worship. So another big name, maybe even really more influential than Luther, at least in the United States, was John Calvin. So he was Swiss, um, and his ideas influenced the Puritans in England, who then came to the United States and had a huge influence on the religious tenor of the early American uh, people, right? So, like Luther, he agreed with the basic um, tenet that nothing you can do can attain your salvation. That's entirely up to God, right? Um, but he sort of adds with this the basic kind of concept that God is all knowing and all powerful, right? So that means that God created the world, right? Um, and God knew from the beginning who was going to go to hell and who was going to go to heaven, right? And he decided from the beginning, right? If he's all knowing and all powerful, he could decide who does it, and he always knew from the beginning everything. So um, from the time you were born, from before the time you were born, it was already decided whether you would go to hell or you would go to heaven. There's literally nothing you can do about it, right? This is the doctrine of predestination. And so this is Calvin's sort of innovation, or just taking Luther's view to its logical conclusion, right? Um, you might be the chosen, you might be damned, you will never know, right? And so the Puritans in England accepted this doctrine. And, if you take that seriously, it's fairly terrifying, right? You're walking around your whole life never knowing, for all you know, you're already condemned to hell. There's no way you can change it. And in a very short time, you are going to be tortured for eternity, right? So um, this gave their sort of their prayers and their meditations and their religious and even psychological tendencies sort of uh, fearful and depressed sort of slant, right? Um, but also a sort of fervent hope and faith, right? The best you could do is just sort of uh, sort of hope and act as if you were one of the elect, and maybe you will be, right? So they were very, strict and very devout, um, but also, I think, tortured internally, right, by this notion. But it wasn't just the Protestants that were sort of rejecting Catholicism wholesale that were interested in reform or different approaches to Christianity. There were reform movements and splinter movements within the Catholic Church. You had Father Ignatius Loyola, who founded the Jesuit movement. He was also looking for a more sort of direct relationship with God. If you were going to join uh, his movement, become a Jesuit, you would go through this 30-day retreat of intense self-reflection to have a sort of intense conversion experience, often a lot of emotion being expressed during that experience. Um, and so, it was a sort of, again, this sort of internal, I just want to uh, examine my soul, am I worthy sort of thing that's uh, kind of a contrast with the official Aristotelian sort of logic approach to mainstream Catholicism. There were prominent women as well that were also um, having religious experiences in this vein, Teresa d'Avila and Jane Frances de Chantal. But this period of the Reformation really was a all-encompassing. Religion was such a big deal. It was tearing countries apart. There were wars fought over it. And it really consumed people's lives. Like whether you were Protestant or a Catholic meant a lot in your everyday life. It was a huge part of your identity. It's wrapped up in the political. So yeah, there were wars fought between Protestant and Catholic countries. Protestant countries were persecuting Catholics. Catholic countries were persecuting Protestants. And the continued prosecution and execution of witches kept going. Um, there was a lot of violence, both physical and also sort of intellectual sparring. There was smaller and smaller splinter denominations within Lutheranism, within Calvinism, each one claiming to be the only way to salvation, all the other denominations being wicked. And I think if you grew up in any of those Protestant traditions, you might be a particular kind of Baptist, Southern Baptist, or whatever. There's very specific sort of denominations, even today in the United States, right? Um, so yeah, religion was all consuming in the political and social life. Pretty much everyone believed in God, or at least professed it. But the sort of all-encompassing obsession with the religion actually had a sort of counterintuitive effect, right? Um, it opened the door to new forms of like skepticism and humanism, and and sort of paved the way to the Enlightenment. So one of the key things about Martin Luther and the success of Protestantism is it came at the time of the invention of the printing press. So before that time, there weren't that many Bibles. To have a Bible, you would have to copy one by hand, right? It could be a life's work to copy a Bible out. So very few people had them, typically priests. You couldn't just check what the Bible said. You would have to go, ask your local priest what the Bible says on a certain matter, and you'd have to go through them. And most people weren't literate anyways. But more people became literate, more people had a Bible in their home, and Luther, uh, would read the Bible himself, he translated it himself, and he interpreted it himself. And sometimes he interpreted it in ways that was different than the Catholic Church, right? And he encouraged other people to do the same thing. Read the Bible yourself, see what it says for yourself, see what you think it means, right? Um, so you get a result is like, uh, as many interpretations of the Bible as there are people, um, and a general sense that Christian doctrine is up for debate, right? And that's really a sort of a short step to the more skeptical view that maybe the Bible isn't literally true, right? Or maybe the church is, not correct on certain things. People were starting to think for themselves, and the um, natural outgrowth of this is what we'll call the Enlightenment, and we'll look at that next. Specifically, we're going to look at Descartes and his arguments for the existence of God based on no Christian dogma whatsoever, right? Based on pure reason.